when the sky is high. No reason to stay on ground. Lift your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix book review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is a fellow graduate of the Vermont College of Fine Arts Writing for Children and Young Adults program. She is the author of 2 picture book biographies, Indelible Anne, the larger-than-life story of Governor Anne Richards, and Dorothy the Brave, which was released on March 28, 2022. Written by Meghan P. Browne and illustrated by Brooke Smart, it is the story of World War II Air Force service pilot Dorothy Lucas. It follows Dorothy from her childhood on a farm in North Carolina during the Great Depression to the start of World War II, when she was inspired to do something more than serve as a Pentagon clerk. You can find Meghan at her website, meghanpbrowne.com, and on social media at Meghan P. Browne. And you can find Brooke at brooke-smart.com and on social media at Brooke Smart Illustration. Meghan P. Browne, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so excited that you're here and excited to talk about this book. But before we get started, would you introduce it and maybe do a little reading for us?
Sure. My name is Meghan P. Browne. This is my second book, Dorothy the Brave. It's the true story of aviator Dorothy Lucas, who flew in World War II. And here's just a little snippet from the middle of my book. In order to apply to the Wasp program, Dorothy would first have to learn to fly. Many others who had proven themselves were daughters of wealth. Their families could afford flying lessons even during that great hard time before the war. Dorothy didn't know that kind of luxury, but she didn't mind making her own luck either. She gathered her courage and asked Mother for a loan to pay for lessons. $200. The kind of money that could put a roof over your head for months. But Mother never hesitated in handing over her savings. Dorothy took flight, knowing that Mother had given her wings.
Well, that's wonderful. And I just want to this book is so beautiful. There's a part of me that wants to see any book that's ever published about a woman in aviation to have this quality, and we'll get into the details of how the mechanics of that later, but I just want to say that you captured so many elements of the stories that I know from the women Air Force service pilots in World War II, from their various very diverse upbringings, coming together to train in Sweetwater and then going off to do the missions that they were required to do. You condensed all that down into a beautiful picture book that will help this legacy live on in the minds of young people, and I'm so grateful for that. And I remember, so when I retired in 2019, I decided that, one of the ways that I wanted to get back into my writing community was to go back and do a graduate assistant semester residency at Vermont College of Fine Arts.
Right.
And I totally remember sitting on the couch with you in the wine pit one night, and you telling me about this book, and I was so excited. I was so grateful. And to see it birthed so much later, because that's the timeline of traditional publishing, which is extremely painful, but worth every second of the wait. So congratulations on the book and on the launch, and thank you for writing it.
Yeah, and that night in the wine pit felt like such kismet to be with you, who really understood the importance of the legacy, because I think that obviously not enough people still know about these women, and I felt so grateful and energized to meet you that night and to know your connection to aviation, and that you really understood this project. And so thank you for being there at that moment, and now too.
I know, what a great, I'll be honest with you, in that moment, I never in a million years envisioned I would be interviewing you about it to post into the world. So it's all good things right now. So I'm glad that you're here. So but we only had a little bit of time together, and I would love to know more about you. What's your background? What brought you to writing?
So I just have always loved writing. I know people say that a lot, and so fine, me too. I was like the co-editor in chief of my high school newspaper, and I carried a journal around with me when I was like in fourth grade through forever because I was just a nerd. And I've always loved to write. And then I went to college and I just didn't do much except essays for class, and I kind of got away from it. And then when I started having children, I left the workforce, and my husband is actually a pilot for Southwest Airlines. And I was home a lot, lost in the minutia of early motherhood with 3 kids under 4. And I started writing again. And it's a strange way that this book came about. I took a class at the Writing Barn in Austin, and I was just focusing on fictional picture books, and I accidentally signed up for a picture book intensive, not knowing that it was a biography intensive. And so I got the instructions to write a manuscript draft, and I was so mad at myself for signing up for the wrong course, and I couldn't get a refund. I didn't even ask because I was so embarrassed. So I just thought, okay, I can do this. And I thought, who did I want to read about when I was a young person? And when I was a girl, I'm the daughter of an Air Force Academy graduate. My dad graduated in 76, and my bedtime stories were Air Force Academy stories. And I thought that I was going to the Air Force Academy. I got nominated by Kay Bailey Hutchison. I went on a recruiting trip for swimming. I really thought that since I was a very little girl, that's what I wanted to do. And it's kind of a long story, but there was some sexual harassment stuff going on in the athletic department at the time. And I just decided to steer clear because of some things in my life. And I just wasn't ready to go that route. But I never fulfilled that dream. But when I was in 8th grade, I did a research project about the Wasp at the urging of my dad and my grandmother, who knew that I was so interested in aviation. If I had to do another project about Amelia Earhart, who was amazing, I was going to scream. And so I did this research project, and my grandmother said, you must interview my friend, Dorothy Lucas. She was a neighbor. And so I did this project and interviewed Dorothy back in 1999 when I was in the 8th grade. And then 20 years later, I got this manuscript submission request, and I for this intensive, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to call Dorothy's kids and see if she's up for another interview. And they said yes. And so 20 years later, I went back and I got to interview her again in 2018. So that's a bonkers story, but that's how the book came to be.
Oh my gosh. That is so, I wish we had talked about that more when we were together. What an incredible story. Oh, so let's go back to you wanting to be in the Air Force and the stuff that happened to you. First of all, I just want to say I'm so sorry that anything deterred you from pursuing that possibility in your life.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it kind of resonates with a very big picture story about women in aviation and about the barriers to entry. And even though maybe those deterrences weren't even related to aviation, just the way that they affected your choices is part of a larger narrative that a lot of us are trying to pull together to help explain, why aren't there more women in aviation? And so I'm sorry to hear that. I have to ask you though, are you still interested in flying?
So that's a great question.
Yeah.
And related to this book. So I don't think it's a coincidence that I ended up marrying a pilot. I think that when I found out that Greg was an aviator, I was very intrigued by that because it was something that I'd wanted to do for so long. So I'll just preface what I'm about to say with that. And then I will say that he is always one of my very first readers, and he read the manuscript and was like, it's missing something. It just doesn't really capture the huge risk that she was taking, because anytime that a pilot goes up, they're taking their fate into their own hands. Like, it's just such a risk to fly. And so the risk that any woman was taking to go to work was huge at this time. But Dorothy's risk was exponential because of the way that she was, and all of the WASP, the way that they were stepping out into the workforce in such a specific way. So he said, I think what you really need to do is you need to go up. And so we got a plane from a friend, and he took me up and handed over the controls. And I just realized, like, I've really lost my cojones. Like, I was pre-motherhood, I was a competitive triathlete. Like, I did the world championship Ironman in Kona, and I was really into cycling. And like, I have a hard time cycling anymore because I'm afraid of dying. So I think that it would take some practice to get over that shift that has occurred in me since I've become a mother. And I'm curious, like, I don't know how maybe you have felt that own shift in yourself. But I think that I used to be, and always have been in my life, like a humongous risk taker. And I think that some of that's come away from me since I've become a mother. But anyway, it was amazing. But then I thought to myself, like, man, I don't know. Am I brave enough to do something like that? Which is part of the reason I feel like I was able to capture in that experience a little bit more of exactly what Dorothy was up against and what she was overcoming.
Oh, I want to talk about this for a second. So the way in which I can relate to that in a very different way.
Okay.
When I was 13 years old, 14 years old, at that time, way back in ancient history, I had read every book Stephen King and Peter Straub had ever written. I loved horror books. I loved them. When I had my first child, I could not handle horror anymore. And so that was my shift. But I was a mother when I went to flight school. I was pursuing this dream that I had as a child. And I didn't... I don't know. For me, like, I knew that I was going to learn the skills to be in control. Is it a risk?
Totally.
Of course. But driving the car down the highway is a risk too.
Yes.
And so I just had, I don't know, I had this unshakable confidence in myself,
Totally.
in the process,
Yeah.
that I just trusted that they were going to teach me what I needed to know to be as safe a pilot as possible. And I was all in. And so I totally get it. Like, I hear you. Like, I used to figure skate when I was a kid, but one of the things that I kind of tested out for fun was roller derby. And I'm a good skater. Like, I have a lot of power. I'm super fast. But a lot of women are a lot bigger than I am. And I don't want my bones to be crushed. And so we all do these risk assessments about like, what risk can I accept? Knowing that I have all of these responsibilities in my life, these children are depending on me. So I get it a little bit, but I also want to encourage you.
And I don't know that I'm like totally putting the lid on all of that. I think that there's still space in my mind that I could pursue that. And I think that I just can't imagine that I won't ever, because it was such a huge part of my dream for so long. And I feel like I'm grateful to have some access to things because of the partner that I chose and all of that, and some knowledge. And so that feels like something I should probably take advantage of. So thank you for encouraging me.
Well, I'm gonna try to encourage you to jump into some women in aviation groups so that you can kind of see the banter that goes on between us, because I think it's a very common thing of like, this is a dream, but is it worth the risk? And then how do we manage those things? So really? I'm going to pull you in. I'm going to pull you in for sure.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll go flying sometime.
Yeah.
I want to know about these conversations that you had with Dorothy and your research. How did you pull all this together?
So Dorothy is 99 now, which is amazing.
She's still with us?
She's still with us. Yeah.
That's glorious. Okay.
Yeah, and actually the Wasp reunion is coming up in 2 weeks, I think. And they usually have it over Memorial Day, but for whatever reason, it's earlier this year. And they didn't, of course, they haven't had it in a couple of years. I went out there in 2018, right after I had interviewed her. And Dorothy's short-term memory is now not very good. When I talked to her in 2018, it was still pretty good. And her son, Tom, was able to come with me. He actually drove me down to her place in San Antonio and just kind of helped kind of jog her memory. Like he would say, Mom, what about the time that, and then she would just go on and tell her stories. And they were so, the Lucases have been amazing. They read the manuscript and they checked things for accuracy, and they provided so many pictures to me and to Brooke. And this project would not have happened without the support that they gave us. They were amazing. And I know that not everybody that does biography has that kind of connection with the family, especially no matter if the subject is living or not. But I feel so grateful that they were so helpful and cooperative. Dorothy told me all sorts of things. In fact, like she told me things that when we walked out, her son Tom said, I haven't heard that story before. So I felt really, really grateful to be able to like, she was telling me about growing up and tending to the cows and the chickens and how much she hated doing that work, which is only really funny because I raise animals at my house and I didn't grow up doing that, but I love doing it. And so I'm curious if my children will hate it also. But anyway.
I just want to say, I saw this little video of your daughter driving a tractor the other day, and I thought that was adorable. I mean, like I grew up, so I didn't talk about myself. I grew up in Texas.
I didn't know that.
I know, like there's so many things we haven't had a chance. So
where did you grow up?
Well, I lived in Houston, so in city girl, but country girl during the summer. I spent my summers in Port Lavaca and Victoria, Texas, milking cows, milking goats, and I learned to drive on an old Jeep Willys on my grandfather's deer hunting lease when I was like 9 years old. So I just loved the little video of your daughter driving because it's like a whole different world from the city. So
it is, yeah. She's 7. That's my youngest, and she is going to change the world. She told me the other day, Mom, how many jobs can you have? Because I really want to be an astronaut and a civil engineer and a writer and a musician. So,
and she can be all of those things.
And I said, you have
absolutely
all the time. Yes.
Yep.
So, anyway, Dorothy was telling me this story about how her folks had animals because they were surviving off of these products that the animals were making, eggs and milk and all the things. So her son had not heard that story. And I also felt really lucky. I looked through ancestry.com was really helpful for me. I was able to pull census records and find occupational records, but also I found this great high school yearbook photo from Dorothy's high school. And it talked about how she loved pineapple ice cream and learning to dive at the beach. And those two details made it in the manuscript. And actually, I'm pretty sure that the pineapple ice cream landed me my agent. I read from this aloud at that epic weekend retreat that I did at the Writing Barn. And my agent was in the audience and she heard that detail and she was like, I love that. It's such like Americana nostalgia. I have to have it. So.
Oh, well, that's a great detail to know, especially when we get to the writing portion of this. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, so when you started doing this research in earnest for the book, like you said you had written a report on her when you were younger, but like, okay, so you wrote the report on her when you were younger and then you did all this research. What surprised you when you were learning about Dorothy and the Wasp? And were there any details that you really wanted to be able to put in the book, but it's a picture book and you only have so many words? Like what did you have to leave out?
And some of the details aren't like super interesting necessarily to kids that are this age group. So like one of my favorite stories was hearing Dorothy talk about how she had ferried some brass to California. And the guy was like so angry that they had put him with her because he did not want to be flown by a woman and he was throwing a fit and she was like, just buckle up, we're gonna go. And so they land, he white knuckled the whole way and then they landed and he asked her to dinner. And I said, Dorothy, what did you say? And she said, I told him that I already had plans for dinner. And so it was just like all of that kind of stuff that I I mean, it didn't have any, I think it actually was in the original manuscript. My editor was like, this is not really kid centric. Like, I don't think kids are going to understand that. And I was like, okay, you're right. But I love having that story in my pocket to tell at school visits or in conversation like this, because I think that that is just such a good anecdote for kind of the temperature of the day. And there's also a really great story. It's a sad story, but I think it's a telling story. The gal who was working in the Pentagon with Dorothy, who told Dorothy about the Wasp, she did flying lessons, and then her parents did not let her go to Sweetwater. And so she didn't get to do that trip, and she didn't get to fulfill that dream, but she did become a flight attendant with Pan Am, and she actually died in an airline crash. So I just think that that is such an interesting story, just the way that life works, that her parents, were so afraid, just like we were talking about earlier, about the risk, but that, so much of life is just uncertain, and that anyway. So that was an
I hear
story.
you. Like she could have been at the controls of a plane and been just fine, but here she was the victim of whatever circumstances ended up, being victimized. That's a really fascinating story.
Yeah.
So there's this certain art, and this is something that I would normally. So I do divide my interviews between sort of just the book, because for a general audience, but then I really like to get into the writing for the writers and like all the details, because I'm there myself, and I have a group of writers who are my audience who listen to these things. But there's this art to putting these complex stories into a picture book, and I want to do an interview with like a picture book agent to really get into like the details of pageant, like how many pages are in a typical picture book and all that stuff. But for you, like taking this big story, creating the language that resonates with young people, and condensing that story down into the bits that you think kind of cover the arc, but also give enough history. Talk about that for you. Like how did that process look for you?
It's really not an easy thing. I think that I always try to start with a portal. Like I just try and think of it as like how sometimes when you go into like a dentist office, or we have one at the local kids consignment store where there's like an adult size door and there's a kid size door. And so I try and think of like, how do I start this book in a place where the kid can open up the kid size door? And so for me, it was the sound of the milk in the pail, because I know not every kid, but I guess a kid could imagine like, oh, the sound of a milk in a pail. That's an interesting kind of kid-centric detail. So those kid-centric details, I think, are the portal. They're the way into the story. And it's a good thing to kind of try and pull those throughout. As I'm writing, I try and think about that, but I definitely try and start at that kid-sized door. And then when I in both of the biographies that I've written, I've tried to usually I make a timeline. Like, what are the things that I see in the story? And then I try and pick the things from the timeline that seem most interesting. Like if I'm having a conversation with my husband or a writing partner, a friend, about the things that I'm learning, the things that I can keep telling, those stories are like the most enticing. They're the most delicious parts. And I know that those are going to be the most exciting to read. And so I make sure that I include those things, and I get the draft done. And then, my agent saw it and she was like, well, I think we could do without this, that, or the other. And then the editor saw it and she said the same thing. Like, I don't think we need the story about, her refusing the date with the guy and all of that. So these things get whittled down as I go, but I think making the timeline really helps. And then focusing on the pieces that are so exciting that I find myself telling people about them or thinking about them often. And then of course, just trying to stay connected to that kid-sized store at all times.
Oh, I love that metaphor so much. Like,
Glad.
I am totally adopting that, and I will give you credit every time I use it. I
Thank you.
absolutely love that.
Thanks.
Before we talk about your other work, was there anything else you wanted us to know about Dorothy that you learned along the way, or about the Wasp that was important to you?
Well, I think that I just feel like it's in the back matter, but that I must say that, that unfortunately, we don't have as many stories about Wasp who were not white, because there weren't many Wasps who were not white. Because, as was the times, most of the women who were not white who applied were not allowed to proceed. And so that was a problem with the program that we now in hindsight can say that was not okay. And thankfully we've, I hope, gotten past a lot of that. I'm sure there are still some problems, as there are in all of our life. And systemically, we deal with all kinds of racism that needs to be addressed still. But there were some WASP who came from different backgrounds, and some of their stories have been told. And some examples of those are in the recommended reading list in the back of my book. So please check out those stories. And also, I urge that people from those communities will also tell those stories, because those stories need to be told. And I didn't feel qualified to tell the stories of those women, but those stories also need to be told. So I hope that we can continue to embrace the entire representation of the women who were involved, while we also keep in mind that not everyone was allowed to be involved.
Absolutely, to all of that. And I just want to point out a couple of things within my own repertoire, and then also things that I haven't had the chance to address yet. So last year, June, July timeframe, we read Fly Girl by Sherelle Smith, and it was a book that imagined a fair-skinned black woman passing as white to become a wasp. And that was just a really interesting creative take, but talking with Cherie, like, she talked about how some of that was based on the history where black women were not allowed to join, but then we, in her own research and in other research that I have seen, both in your book and elsewhere, that we had a couple of Chinese ladies. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to mention another gorgeous book that I hope to get to and interview the author for, is The Fearless Flights of Hazel Ying Lee. It is a gorgeous picture book, same quality. So grateful that the author, and I will put the author's name in the notes, published that book. So please, all of you, if you're building a library of books that feature women in aviation, you get Dorothy the Brave, you get The Fearless Flights of Hazel Ying Lee for sure. It's gorgeous.
And that's listed in the recommended reading. But I will also say that I studied Skyward by Sally Dang.
It's beautiful too.
That one is also super high quality picture book. The story of 3 different female aviators from different places. And that was fascinating to me too.
I agree. And that's another author on my list too. And she, I think, was the author and illustrator. So that's kind of a neat detail too.
Yes.
So those are the picture books. And then you also, like in this, I love that you brought up the back matter, because I wanted to talk about that too. Like you have several of the women who I admire who write in this sort of niche and genre or whatever. But Sarah Byrne Rickman is listed here with one of her books. She has 12 books that feature Wasp. So, and I did an interview with her last March. So anybody who's interested in the Wasp history, please go listen to her, because she is a former journalist who embedded herself in the Wasp and became their friends, and just made it her life mission to tell their stories. And she continues to do it.
She was the cornerstone of my research when I was in 8th grade. So I will tell you that so much of what I was able to find was like a blip in the encyclopedia, and then all of Sarah's stuff. And then when I went to the memorial on Memorial Day weekend in 2018, I got to sit next to her at lunch. And I was like vomiting all of the gushing praise, like, I want to be you someday. And anyway, so that was just like a huge moment for me, that I got to tell her how important her work was to me, and that I was hoping to bring some of that incredible knowledge and research that she had done to a younger audience. And so that I feel so grateful to her for, I mean, truly, she has preserved so much history and all of the life work that she has done, truly.
Okay, now I'm gonna lose it. Like, I love all that. She's so lovely, and to think about, like, she's written adult books. She's written books for a young adult audience featuring specific Wasp, and then for you to bring in the picture books and help like lead those girls to an interest in this history to go find later is just, that's like a gorgeous circle. So I'm really grateful for all that.
Oh, well, I just, it wasn't too long ago. I feel like pre-pandemic, but maybe like early 2019 or late 2018, a bunch of the WASP families went to the Texas legislature because the WASP history was at risk of being excised from the textbooks. And so many of the textbooks that go out nationwide originate in Texas. So much of what's distributed nationwide starts in Texas. Texas is a huge hub for textbook literature for schools. And so the WASP families went down to make sure that that didn't happen. And I am so grateful for that, that their legacy is being preserved in the textbooks, and that now we can say to those fourth grade teachers, here's this small column in this humongous textbook, and now here's, my book, but also here's Julie Lang's book, and here's Sally Dang's book, and here are all the different books that you can supplement your classroom teaching with.
Oh my God, that's so good to know. Like, I didn't know any of that was going on, and obviously, like, all that WASP history is like the housing for that is there in Texas, and so it's wonderful to know that that connection is there and that they're making sure that that gets in the books, because, like, who knows what kind of imagination and inspiration that's going to spark for young women. So I'm
Absolutely.
grateful for that. And the only other author I will mention that I'm not sure if I saw her listed, but is Erin Miller. She has the adult book Final Flight, Final Fight, who wrote about her grandmother. But then she also has a more recent children's picture book, which is What Grandma Did. And I just want to give her props. And there are so many other books out there.
Yes.
But I loved the back matter in this, and I have like visions for back matter in my own books. So like, hey, here's the story, but like you can go find information somewhere else, and I love that.
Yes. And I get to actually, I'm going out to Sweetwater for the reunion, and Erin is going to be there too. So I'm excited. I don't know. I feel like we maybe met. We were talking about this over Instagram. Like, did we meet like a few years ago? I don't know. We'll definitely do it this time.
I'm so jealous that you're getting to go. Like, so I think I've mentioned this in other interviews, but I was in Women in Aviation International, involved in that back when I was in the Coast Guard, when I was still actively flying, and I had the opportunity, like, where I met most of the WASP, and also some of the Russian women who flew that we call the night witches.
Yeah.
Through the flight suits, the military flight suit social. So Women in Military Aviation has a flight suit social at all these things. And this was 12 years ago. But like, I met so many WASP, B. Haydu and others who used to come. I have a picture of my daughter with B, and tragically we lost her last year. So, it was just a special experience. It really drove home the importance of their impact and their inspiration for us as a community. And so for you to be able to go to Sweetwater, like, I'm super jealous of that, because the women who are still with us aren't going to be with us for much longer, and it's really beautiful.
Actually, I got a call from the folks at the museum, and they were looking for Dorothy's contact information because they wanted to make sure they got an invitation to her. And I don't think she's going to be able to come, but they said that they believe she might be the last living WASP. And I know, I thought, how can it be? But so much has happened in the last 2 years, and I feel like I haven't been able to keep tabs on everything as closely as I would have hoped to. And I'm sure everyone's having that issue. So I hate to spread rumors. I don't know, because she was one of the youngest, right? So that was part of the thing. And she's 99. I don't mean to spread a rumor, but I will say that like that those words came from one of the directors of the museum.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you again for putting this story in this book for young people so that it lives on, hopefully,
My
for
absolute
generations.
honor and pleasure, truly.
Well, so this is not your only book. You have one that's already published and you have one that's coming out next year. And I want to talk about those two real quick.
Okay.
So let's hear about Indelible Anne.
This is Indelible Anne. I have her right here, about Anne Richards, who was just a dynamo. I can't not smile when I talk about Anne Richards. For folks who didn't grow up in Texas, you may not know, but if you might know, because she was such an amazing woman.
Before you start,
Yeah.
okay, so let me just
Go.
so let me do the thing. Okay,
Yes, do it.
so I grew up in Texas, and I moved from Texas to Georgia in 1989.
Okay.
And I was oblivious. I didn't know anything about Anne, and I don't have the book, and I'm gonna buy it after this, because right before I jumped on, I was like, let me look at Anne. Like, I had been meaning to do it, and you know, like I got involved in it, and I'm getting ready for this interview, and I'm gonna research Anne real quick. And so I saw Anne's biography or whatever on Wikipedia, and the fact that she spoke at the 1988 Democratic Convention. And so I searched it, and I was able to pull her up. Now,
Did you watch it?
I was only able to, this is literally 15 minutes before we get on. But let me just tell you my impressions
After
already.
this, you're watching it. Okay.
Oh no, I'm totally watching the rest of it. So let me just give you my impressions first and foremost. So the hair. Okay, my grandma in Texas was a hairdresser, and back in the old days, she had her own shop. But when I was spending summer with her, she was doing hair in her kitchen, and she was doing perms, and all of that gorgeous, poofy, curly hair. My grandma did that art on women, and I smelled it. Watched it.
Yes.
I watched my grandma chewing. She would chew while she would cut. It was so cute. And then she said this thing, and I actually typed it out because I thought it was so funny. She said, "After listening to George Bush all these years, I thought you should hear what a real Texan accent sounds like." I was like, and then it just went on and on. She was so great. She connected with the audience in such a genuine way. And now I want to know everything about her. So you tell me.
Okay. So I was in kindergarten living in Austin, which is the capital, where all the politicos go to die, right? This is just where it all happens. And actually, my grandfather ran for railroad commissioner back on the, I don't know, Eisenhower days. He was on the Republican side. So, but the thing about Texas, right, is that it takes a real, and I don't want to speak to today's politics because we are in a whole mess of hurt down here, but there have been times where real middle of the road people who were practical and thoughtful of others were in politics, including Anne. And so I knew, I was in kindergarten when she was elected governor, and I just never knew that wasn't an option for me to be the governor of Texas. That was never out of my mind. This whole idea of women knowing that girls knowing that this happened, and little girls knowing that this happened, it's so important. My little girls didn't know that this happened, right? They didn't know that Anne Richards, we've had a man in the governor's house, the governor's mansion in Texas for so long that they didn't know that was a thing, right? So I needed to tell this story. But as a young girl, I didn't know that that was not available to me, thanks to Anne. And part of Anne's biggest mission was getting people in the Capitol of all kinds so that the children of Texas could imagine themselves there someday, because they needed to see people that looked like their parents in government in order to imagine that for themselves. And so, for the same reason that my husband carries these books in his flight bag so that when little girls come up to the cockpit, he can hand them one. Like this is why it's important that we are telling these stories, and not just of white women, of people who are doing things that don't look like the traditional people doing the things, right? So that's part of the reason why it's so important. But anyway, so back to Anne. She was more than she just was her own tall tale. She truly was bigger than life. I actually went out to LA last week, which is weird to even say because it's been so long since any of us could do things like
saw that. You went to a show about Anne. That's so fun.
Yeah. So Holland Taylor, who is an incredible actress, wrote a one-act play called Anne, and I've seen it before, but not with her starring, and she starred in it. And the illustrator, Carlin Witt, who's an East Texas native, she's out in LA, and she said, Holland is doing this play out here. Can you meet me? And I said, yes, I can. My best friend from college lives in Pasadena, and so I got to stay with her. But on a whim, when we were in the middle of like finalizing covers and stuff, I reached out to Holland, who had started following me when I had mentioned I was working on this project on Twitter, which is really weird because I have like 10 followers on Twitter, including Holland Taylor. And I just asked her, I put my very awkward pants on and I embarrassed myself and said, I would love to send you a digital ARC, an advanced reader copy. And if you would like to read it and tell me what you think, I would love it. And then I got her to blurb it. She blurbed it.
Oh, yeah, girl.
And so anyway, I got this Hollywood star to say, cannily written and beautifully illustrated, Indelible Anne delighted this old person and will surely encourage young readers to see a path in life that is open to them all, everyone. And so anyway, I got to go see Holland do the play. And I don't know, I'm grateful that all kids can read about both of these incredible women.
Well, everything that you said about that applies to every field, but obviously I'm in a very niche focus here.
Absolutely.
About like presenting young people with examples of success so that they have a path to follow. They have those breadcrumbs. So I think it's wonderful. I can't wait to learn more about Anne, and I plan to when we get done. Yay. And then you have this other book that's coming out that sounds super fascinating also, and it's called The Bees of Notre Dame?
Yes, it is. And it's a little bit unfortunate that a Spanglish speaker like myself wrote a book about some French bees and included some French words, because I'm going to have a horrible time at read alouds. I'm going to have to get some tutoring. But so I keep bees at my little hobbyist farm here in South Austin. And when I was talking to my literary agent, when we first got together, she was like, I bet you've got a bee book. What's the bee book? And I could never figure it out. And then the horrible fire at Notre Dame happened. And this story came across the wire about these honey beehives that were on the rooftop, and everyone wanted to know, did the bees survive? Did the bees survive? And nobody knew. And people kept sending me this article from USA Today. And then, yes, the word came that the drones went down and they found out that, yes, the honey beehives were okay. And so I emailed my agent and I said, is this my bee story? And she said, how fast can you get it to me? And I said, well, I've never been to Paris except Paris, Texas. So I probably ought to go. So I did what any airline spouse does, and I non-revved on an American to France. And I was there a week after the fire. And on the way over, I Google searched and found email addresses for the people that they interviewed in the article, which were the beekeepers that had been taking care of these beehives. And I said, I'm coming. Can I interview you? And they're like, no, we're busy. We're doing work. And so I emailed them. I said, well, I'm coming. So I'd really love to interview you. And they said, well, we're not even in Paris. So no, it's not going to work. And I said, well, I'd love to see your storefront. I would really love to meet you. I'll be there this day. I can't wait to take an Uber to wherever you are. And
I'm American and I'm coming.
And they were, I'm sure, not pleased. But I brought my veil and some beekeeping gloves to kind of like show them that I was a real beekeeper and that I spoke their bee language, not their actual language. And they were so wonderful to me. Nick Gyant, who is the owner of the company, he set me up with Sibyl Mulan, who did all of the translating. And then I said, well, I would love to come back and see more about what you do. And they said, we would love to have you. You can either come like do work in the field, or you can go with Sibyl and tend to the beehives all over the rooftops of Paris. To which I said, yes, please. And then I felt like a French Mary Poppins for the whole next day. And we didn't get to go to like Notre Dame. It was burnt, of course. But I did all that research and it was so magical. And then I came home and I couldn't really figure out how to write the story. And I did that story while I was so like this Indelible Anne book the muse was strong. It like came to me almost the way that it is in the book. The Dorothy book, sort of similar, not quite so strong. The bee book went through like 20 different iterations. Like at one point, the narrator was the beehive. There were so many different iterations of that text. And finally, I was in the picture book intensive with Jane Kurtz at VCFA, and she really helped me land that manuscript where it needed to be with her guidance. Jane is such like a magical fairy godmother. She just helped me and I wrote and sold that manuscript as COVID was like exploding. And so I feel really grateful for that. But the illustrator for that is E.B. Goodale, and she just went to Paris to do her own research. And she just got back, and we should be seeing sketches soon. And I cannot wait. She totally got it. She got that she needed to be there and immerse herself. And she went and she sketched, and I can't wait to see what she comes up with.
Okay, well, so when I was stationed in Barbados, 2018, they give you a stipend to if you serve overseas, they give you a stipend to travel for the cost of a trip back to the closest port of entry to the United States. And so my family chose to go to Europe. I took our buddy. I have a 29-year-old son. She's 19 now, and my 9-year-old, several years ago. But so I very carefully planned this trip. I had been to Paris as a teenager. I had studied French, and so that's kind of like the high school trip that I went on.
Good. I found my tutor. Good. Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to and there's a little French Creole and Haitian Creole in the books that I'm writing too, because I have an interest in Haiti. But so we went, and I'm a planner. Like I could be a
travel
tour
agent.
guide. That's what I do. So I had this great Airbnb that was literally right across the Seine from Notre Dame. We could see it from our window.
Oh my gosh.
It's gorgeous. And it was, a little bit over a year and a half before that happened. And so my whole family felt it viscerally. Because they had been there, they had this tie to it. Mm-hmm. And then when I saw that was the topic of your book, I thought this is so lovely. And what a wonderful opportunity to educate people on something that's totally we talk a lot about in writing, and which we'll talk about more deeply, but in the idea of bringing two very different ideas together in a fresh and unique way. And look what you did. You're a bee farmer, and you tied that to Notre Dame, and that is so unique and so fresh and so interesting that it gives it all a whole new life of its own.
Well,
so it's wonderful.
Very kind of you. It's really it's really, I can't even quite say the ties of the metaphor for the cathedral and the beehive are so strong. This cathedral was built over so many generations. So the ceiling that burned in the fire was made of trees who started as seeds when the Vikings were conquering Europe. Like, it is so old. The building was touched by so many different hands. There were so many different artisans who did so much work to carry these stones, on through the cobblestone streets, and these carts, and then these laborers who were doing stained glass by hand with lead. And I mean, the whole story of the cathedral is so long in the making, just as the beehive, the bees only live for a certain amount of time, just weeks. They're living in a creation that was made by their ancestors. So it's a similar metaphor here. And just, it felt like that was such a strong thing to me. It seemed so obvious, but it was I'm having trouble putting it into words right now. It's so immense and so important that it was really hard for me to get the words on the page. And I just feel really grateful to all of the people that really helped me get there.
You are just punctuating this belief that I have, and this thing that I've said in my house so many times. I used to say it all the time when I was on active duty in the military. Like, listen, I loved my opportunities in the Coast Guard. I had a great career, but my creative life was tugging at me. I mean, it was ripping at me.
Yes.
And I would say all the time that the only unique gifts that I have to offer this world are my children and my creative pursuits. The ways in which I tie my curiosity, my interests, and my experience together into this unique gift to the world that nobody else can do. Nobody else can create what I create. And that's how I see that project for you. Like, nobody else in the world could have tied that immense importance to those two things and put them together in that creative way. And I'm so excited to see that book.
Thank you.
So when does it come out?
So that one is going to be forever. It's not coming out until fall of 23, probably. The whole thing was that the editor on that is Anne Kelly at Random House Studio, and Anne loved the book so much when she saw it. She also did Indelible Anne with me, and she saw it and said yes. And also, I really want to try and get E.B. Goodale for this project. She's been somebody that I've been trying to work with for a long time, and I think this might be the one that she will agree to. And she sent it to E.B.'s agent, and she said no, she's booked. She's not taking on any projects because she also writes her own things now too, and so she's just not taking on any illustrated only projects right now. She's just really booked. And Anne said, can you please just have her read it? I think she might be open. And then she said, yes, but it's going to be a while because she's booked. So anyway, and it worked out well because of the pandemic. E.B. is the kind of illustrator that does immersive research. So she wrote a book about a little house and went and lived in a little house with her family so that she could really capture the whole thing. And then she wanted to write this book. So she did what I did and went to Paris and met with the same people that I did. And she found out new details, like the beehives are now kept in a garden adjacent to they're not on the roof anymore. And she said, I never would have known that if I hadn't gone. And so there are all sorts of things that you learn if you're able to go. And I think even like the smells of the street and the sounds and all of that is so hard to capture unless you're there. And I really come to story through setting. And so it was important for me to be there, but I so appreciate that she felt the same way. And I feel like that will be a good benefit to the stories that we both did that immersive research.
That's a perfect note to kind of wrap up this portion on. Like, we've already given props to you as a picture book writer, because I think that people not in the writing world who look at picture books are like, oh, that's easy.
That's cute.
I could write a picture book in 5 minutes and be done. And no, you couldn't. But let's give props to your illustrators. So
Yes.
you've mentioned this one. So
What's your favorite? Can you tell me what your favorite spread is? Because I have to talk about this. Is like my favorite thing to do with pictures.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah.
so fun. Like, but I just want to say though, like, okay, I'm a huge, well, I'm somewhere in the middle, because I've spent the last year talking to authors who are self-published and authors who are traditionally published. I am still sort of under the spell of traditional publishing for a variety of reasons, mainly of which because I'm trying to reach a young adult audience who I don't have access to within my network. I want to reach girls who don't have people in their lives who are flying. I love that network, and they are my friends, and they're like in political terms, my base.
Yes.
And I'm grateful for their kinship and their support of my work, but I need to get to other people. And so there's this process that happens, and it's long and it's a little painful, but just like, and this is like insider joke with the Vermont College of Fine Arts sort of magic hat that pairs you with your advisor, and you just gave Jane Kurt so many props, which she absolutely deserves as a fairy godmother. And I would offer that every advisor there is the fairy godmother or godfather that we needed for whatever our work was doing at the time. There's a magic that happens in the publishing industry for picture books and matching stories with illustrators. So that's what I'm going to say about that, and you can talk about your illustrator.
Yeah, Brooke Smart. Oh my gosh. So when Tamar Brazos at Viking Children's acquired this, and she gave me a list of 3 illustrators that she felt would be good for this project, and Brooke was at the top of the list. And when I looked at all of these illustrators, they were all amazing, but Brooke was also at the top of my list. And so we crossed our fingers, and the ask was made, and she agreed. And Brooke's attention to detail is so incredible. She took all of those pictures that the Lucas family gave us, and like this, there's a picture of Dorothy's mother at the football game where they found out the news about Pearl Harbor, and she's wearing this coat, and we have a picture of Dorothy's mother in this coat. Like, she used all of that information. And we did a book launch through the King's English in Utah, where Brooke is from, and she showed some spreads of research that she had done about fashion through the day, and also like what the office space may have looked like in the Pentagon, and what, she was really, really careful about the details that she included. And I feel so grateful. There was also a moment where, when I had gone to the reunion in Sweetwater in 2018, the women were telling stories about how it would get so hot and they'd carry their mattresses outside, and Brooke illustrates this in the pages. And when I got the sketches, I said to my editor, I think it's great, but I'm just curious, because I had written mattresses, and I was like, I don't know if this is right. And the editor said, well, actually, Brooke sent me this image, and it's like a newspaper clipping with the beds outside. And I felt so grateful that we were both doing our very best work to get the details so right, not just in the words, but also in the pictures. And that is such a big piece of picture book nonfiction. And so that was really, really beautiful for me to see that she was working, just as hard, if not harder than I was, to get to the bottom of every little detail.
Oh, that's so great. That so justifies, like you hear a lot of picture book authors, or at least, I am not one right now. I have ideas potentially for picture books in the future, but I do hear this conversation happening a lot, and especially within my field, where women are aviators, and they want to tell this very particular story, and they don't want to give control up to somebody else who's going to mess it up. They're going to get the wrong plane or the whatever in there. But to hear a story like that where you were matched so well with someone who is so conscientious that she would do her own work and trust that she's a professional. And you asked what my favorite spread is. It's hard to say, but for me, like with the images that have formed in my mind over the years of the camaraderie and the support that happens in the Wasp and Sweetwater through their training, I have to say that this might be my favorite one, this sisterhood that comes together in support of Dorothy when her brother, she has learned that her brother has died, and that her mother is calling her home, and her girls are like, no, you've come too far. You've got to finish now. Yeah. And so like for me, I feel like that picture resonated with me a lot. And of course, I like anything with a plane in it. So this picture of Dorothy in the cockpit is gorgeous. And then of course the target towing, which is a terrifying prospect. Like, I can't believe those women did that, but
I know, terrifying.
Yeah, but it's hard to say, but like I feel like emotionally that thing, you know, I've talked about this 100 times on my interviews, but Liz Burgess, my roommate at Vermont College of Fine Arts, wrote her critical essay on her critical thesis on when do readers cry, and it's when they get what they need. And I just felt like when the main character gets what they need. And I felt like Dorothy was having a moment of where she got what she needed in that book, where in your story, where her sisters came to her side and was like, no, you can't quit now. So
that was to hear Dorothy tell that story too was really incredible. And to imagine this, Dorothy's mother was, the same one who I had read had given her the money to do this completely unorthodox thing, to go learn to fly, to go do this thing. And she had always been so supportive of her. And then her mother was saying, I can't, you have to come home now. I mean, it was really a moment of truth for her to be like, well, I've got to do this. My mother has done so much for me. And then to see her sisters keep her there. Yeah, that was an incredible moment. This is my favorite spread, this American flag with all the women going in one direction and all the men going in another direction, and Dorothy in the middle trying to, figure out where she belongs in this whole scheme of social construct. And I'll tell you that I asked Brooke this question, and her favorite spread is this one. And I asked her why, and she said, because this spread of Dorothy with her instructor and the crop duster felt like this is freedom. This is freedom to me. And Dorothy was finding her freedom. And I thought, wow, Brooke, that's so great. And then the other little Easter egg I will tell you about that Brooke shared with me is that I told her how much I loved these little birds that are all throughout the book. And she said she wanted there to be flight on every page. And so whether it's the flag kind of fluttering in the background or the seagulls at the beach, she wanted flight on every page. And I thought that was really wonderful. So that is the kind of like next level that an illustrator can bring to your book for anyone that's like, I can't relinquish control. Like the illustrator, in my opinion, elevates the story to places you could never imagine.
Oh, that's such a great endorsement of that, and such a beautiful story. And anybody who's listening, like, you've got to get this picture book so that you can follow along with all these things, because we've held up the book to show these pictures.
Yes.
But that's so wonderful. Do you have anything to say about Indelible Anne's illustrator?
Yes, I will. So Carlin, similarly, just blew me away with her talent and her research and her passion for this subject. She clearly got it too. And I think that whenever there's a pairing that takes place, and I feel like I've been lucky enough to have a pairing each time where the illustrator really got it. And so my favorite spread in the Indelible Anne book is my favorite for a really interesting reason. And I know this doesn't help your podcast listeners, but there's a spread in the middle of the book where Anne, who's the county commissioner, is wearing a hard hat with all these other guys in the boys club. And she's with the road crew, and they're talking about the plans for the Pennybacker Bridge, which runs through West Austin, and there's a little dog in the middle of the page. And this dog represents a story that I wish I could have put in the text, but it just didn't belong. And I never told Carlin that, but Carlin did her own research, and she thought this story about the dog was so intriguing that she had to put that little pooch in there. And when I saw that, I just screamed out loud because I was so thrilled that she had read this story about Anne was elected county commissioner. And for those of you who don't know much about Texas politics, I'm not really sure how it works other places, but each county in Texas, there are 247 counties. Each county in Texas gets, or maybe it's 74. And now I'm blanking. I feel bad, a bad native Texan right now, but I think it's
Nobody's going to check you on the numbers. We're a bunch of writers here.
I'm pretty sure it's
writers and readers.
But anyway, so each county gets, I believe, they get a certain number of county commissioners, and these commissioners sit on a court and they decide where different tax funds go to. So some go to jails, and some go to health and human services, and some go to road building. And a big thing that was going on in Travis County, which is where I live and where Anne was the precinct commissioner at the time, was that they were trying to build these roads. And so she had gone out to the yard where all the highway equipment was being kept to have this meeting with these good old boys. And she walked in and she said, "My, that sure is an ugly dog you have." This was the kind of woman that Anne was. And they said, "Oh yes." They all started giggling, and they got upstairs, and she just could not understand why they were still laughing about the dog. And she said to them, "You know, my daddy cussed like a sailor, so I would really appreciate if you tell me what you're laughing about." And they said, "Well, it's about our dog, our ugly dog's name, ma'am." And she said, "You can tell me what her name is." And they said, "Well, her name is Miss Anne. We named her after you." And so I love that story so much. And I couldn't put it in the text. It had no place. But Carlin saw that in her research, and she knew it was as funny as it was. And so she put that dog in the story. And so that is the kind of stuff that happens when you have another collaborator on the project that really gets it. And Carlin just did. So there's all kinds of that sort of stuff that's in that book.
That's such a great story. Oh my gosh. Well, Meghan, I want to talk to you a little bit about publishing and marketing and all that stuff, but I just want to close out this portion of the interview to say thank you so much for this book, for bringing your curiosity, your passion, and your writing skill, and your tenacity to go through the traditional publishing process, which is long and painful, and we'll talk about the aftermath of that when we get into the writer's portion. Thank you for putting yourself through that to help this legacy live on.
Well, thank you for having me and for pursuing your own dreams and being that light for all of the girls who are watching women like you who are doing big things in aviation.